All right, American History Hybrid students, here we are, Week 8 notes. This week we're going to take a look at World War I, also referred to the Great War or also as the War to End All Wars. The years we're looking at here are between 1914 and 1918, and another important date would be 1917 when the U.S. enters the war. All right, this week you should be able to answer the following learning objectives. 1. Identify the causes and long-term effects that led to World War I. 2. Summarize the U.S. public opinion about World War I. 3. Explain why the U.S. entered World War I. 4. Describe how the U.S. mobilized for World War I. 5. Identify the new weapons that were introduced during World War I. 6. Summarize the major battles and impact of World War I. 7. Explain how the government promoted the war. 8. Describe the attacks on civil liberties after the war and summarize the social change that occurs after the war. 9. Describe how Woodrow Wilson tries to promote peace with his 14 points. 10. Describe the Treaty of Versailles and the international and domestic reaction to it. And lastly, describe the consequences and aftermath of World War I. All right, here we go. Let's begin. Okay, take a look at this phrase and then go ahead and answer the following two questions to yourself. And again, stimulate prior knowledge as we begin to look at major events that led to World War I. All right, some of the major events that we're talking about here: nationalism, militarism, alliances, and imperialism. Those are really the core four. We'll see those in multiple texts, but some texts or historians will also allude to international anarchy as well as the power of the press, specifically propaganda. When we look at nationalism, we see the global competition for colonialism. Germany is growing in power in Europe. We see, again, ethnic cleansing that takes place. Nation-state building, which you learned last year in world history. Nation-state building begins in the 1800s. Again, that'll spill into the 1900s or the turn of the 20th century. We'll see, again, Russia cleansing for the Slavic people and Serbs in the Balkans and Austria-Hungary. Again, we'll see the rise in nationalism. With imperialism, which would jump to number 4. Again, Germany will begin to industrialize, will grow in competition, but they kind of get in the game late in terms of conquering colonial lands abroad. And so they'll try to compete with France and Britain to contest for these colonies. And what they'll do, they'll build the strongest navy in the world. They'll counter the strongest navy in the world, which is Britain during this time, and they'll start to build major battleships and destroyers. We look at militarism, that kind of alludes right into militarism. Again, Wilhelm II, who's the Kaiser of Germany, vows to be the strongest in the world to overtake the British Navy. Again, we see him trying to compete again against British. The German shipyards will again produce major battles and destroyers. France, Italy, Japan, and the United States will quickly join in the naval arm race. And we'll also see alliances. During this war, we'll see Allied powers, also known as the Triple Entente. They'll be composed of France, Britain, and Russia. And then there will be the Triple Alliances, also referred to as the Central Powers, which will be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Ottoman Empire will also join to the Central Powers. Again, to repeat that, the Central Powers will be Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the Allied powers will be France, Great Britain, and Russia. But something to keep in mind, Russia will back out of the war in 1917 because there will be a Russian Revolution that takes place. Okay, again, what I have already referred to. Okay, again, those secret alliances, again, are referring to just the alliances from the previous slide. But most of those alliances were held under wraps. In other words, they were not communicated openly through media, or during this time through paper or newsprint propaganda.
Boys.
All right, so in the Balkan region, also known as the powder keg, again, the powder keg, when we're talking about the Balkan region, specifically countries today like Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Albania, um, that region of the world today. Gavro Principe, who is going to be a leader, a revolutionary leader for the Black Hand. The Black Hand is an organization to promote Serbian nationalism. Again, during this time, Serbia was controlled by the Austria-Hungary Empire. So Gavro Principe, which is pictured right here, will work for this organization to liberate Serbia from Austria-Hungary. And so in 1914, Gavro Principe assassinates the next Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is going to be the crowned king of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He assassinates him in the capital of Serbia, which is Sarajevo. And a blank check from Germany is issued. Germany, August 1st, Germany, obligated by treaty to support Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on Russia's allied France. After Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Great War had begun. And so again, we see this powder keg sets off the catalyst with Gavro Principe assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So the war begins. Germany will invade Belgium, following a strategy known as the Schiffen Plan. Let's see, is the video going to play for us this week? Nope. Okay, just to repeat what I had mentioned earlier, just kind of give you a visual. Okay, the Schiffen Plan again violates Belgium's neutrality. Trench warfare is going to set the stage for most of the war. Again, this war we won't see. Pretty much it's going to be fought along the battle lines of what divides France and Germany. There won't be much movement by either the Central Powers or the Allied powers during this war. The trench war between the trenches, which we'll get into later, is known as the No Man's Land. Again, not much advancement during World War I, but extremely deadly. Again, this is referred to as the stalemate. Russian crisis, again, we look at Imperial Russia. The last of the Romanov family, Nicholas II, is being overthrown by a Bolshevik movement, which is a socialist, later a communist movement. Again, the United States declares neutrality when the war begins. However, it proves to be difficult simply because we, during this time, depend heavily on exporting our industrial goods to parts both of Central as well as Allied countries. However, more of our relationships resided with that of the Allied countries during this time. And again, trying to promote peace. All right, many opportunities to volunteer at home. We'll talk more about this later. Okay, so again, we're going to take a look at some of the reasons why the United States is pulled in. Two that you want to make note of is The first is the sinking of the Lusitania, and the second is the Zimmerman Note. Um, the sinking of Lusitania. We also see secret submarine warfare during this time, um, largely led by the Germans and the British. um, Often, when we see neutrality, some of the Americans at home felt they were divided loyalties. Socialists criticized the war as a capitalist imperialist struggle between Germany and England to control markets of colonies such as colonies in China, Africa, and Middle East. Um, and many Germans in America at the time sympathized with the Germans. The Irish during this time had a chance for Ireland to gain independence, so they felt the war was in the best interest for the United States to enter. Many Americans felt close to Britain because of the common ancestry and language. Again, going back to trading, American trade with Britain and France is more than double its trade with Germany during this time. All right, so the Lusitania is sinking. One of the worst disasters in 1915, when a German U-boat sank the British liner, the Lusitania, off the southern east coast of Ireland. 1,198 persons were lost, 128 which were Americans. The Germans defended their action on the grounds that the liner carried ammunition. Despite Germany's explanation, Americans became outraged with Germany because of the loss of lives, and American public opinion began to turn against Germany. About 3 months later, after the Lusitania, a U-boat sank another British liner, the Arabic, drowning 2 Americans. Again, the United States protested, and this time Germany agreed not to sink any more passenger ships. Then we have in 1916, so roughly, 6 months later, Germany broke its promise and torpedoed an unarmed French passenger ship called the Sussex. The Sussex sank, and about 80 passengers, including Americans, were killed or injured. Once again, the United States warned that it would break off diplomatic relations with Germany unless they changed their naval tactics. And again, Germany agreed. So, again, we see Germany, again, stating that they will stop the sinking of ships, but yet they don't. And again, the Arabic Pledge, which I just mentioned, and the Sussex Pledge, which I just mentioned. Oh, sorry about that. All right, some things to think about. Let me go back. I'm so sorry. And again, the Zimmerman note should have been on here, but make note of the Zimmerman note. Again, this is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the catalyst that really provokes the United States and Congress to declare war. Germans invaded Wilson's call for peace. The Kaiser announced that the U-boats will sink all ships in the British water. Over time, the Kaiser will issue a telegram to Mexico and asking Mexico for their help. And if Mexico were to help in World War I, they promised that they would reclaim the land that they had lost in the territories they lost in Guadalupe Hidalgo, or the war with Mexico. Those territories being Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And really, those two acts they bring the United States into war. In other words, neutrality is shattered. All right, so again, why did the U.S. get involved? We see the submarine warfare, we see the Allied propaganda, we see hostilities, we see American idealism, again talking about democracy versus monarchies, and we see economic interests, again siding with both powers, but heavily with the Allied powers during this time. And then U.S. security of their passengers and naval ships that transport across the Atlantic. U.S. preparation for war. Again, U.S. They were not well prepared at all. About 200,000 men were in service when war was declared, and few officers had combat experience. Drastic measures were needed to build an army and modern enough to impact the war. They really didn't understand what war was. There was no idea of the ramifications behind a global scale war. We have never seen this in world history before. So again, the Army will lack. The Army will lack in military supplies, weaponry, ammunition. Um, they will not really understand combat duties or tactics. They did go through what was an 8-month training, but again, the 8-month training proved insufficient when they arrived on the fronts of the trenches. Okay. All right. So again, we see the National Defense Act protecting U.S. Consumer ships that travel the Atlantic. Zimmerman note was that telegram by the Kaiser to the Mexican president asking them to ally with the Germans to defeat. I'm sorry, the Zimmerman note sent by Kaiser Wilhelm from Germany asking the Mexicans to join the Central Powers to defeat the Ally. In return, they would give back the land that U.S. had claimed from them. Selective Service Act is put in place, and again, this is passed in 1917. The act required men to register with the government in order to randomly select military service. All in all, about 24 million men had registered under the act. Of this number, about 3 million were called up. Okay, so we see the government now recruiting infantry for the first time in American history. All right, Americans tipped the balance. Again, we already referred to this, not prepared, Selective Service Act I just referred to. They did exempt shipyard workers because, again, they wanted the shipyard workers to increase the production of ships as well as destroyers. And then we also see women taking on non-combative duties. When we see women taking on non-combative duties, really we're looking at women that did not have ranking. They received insufficient pay as well as benefits. But about 13,000 women, according to Holt, had non-combat duties in both the military or in the Navy and the Marines. Often they served as nurses, secretaries, telephone operators. Again, the shipyards used during this time, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce joining the public relations, again exempting shipyard workers. It was important for the shipyard workers who at this time used prefabricated techniques, which increased the industrial production or mass production of these destroyers and mostly destroyers, but also some other merchant ships. Government took control over the commercial and private ships. We see a convoy system. This is a system in which heavy guard or destroyers escort merchant ships back and forth across the Atlantic in groups. Shipping losses had been cut in half. We see during this time Americans that were during the war were very enthusiastic. They were excited. They were led by John J. Pershing, who again was a major general in the Spanish-American War, and include many American infantry were nicknamed doughboys, possibly because they wore white belts during this time, and they had a clean look to them. Most doughboys had never ventured from their farms or small towns where they lived, and the sophisticated sights and sounds of Paris made a vivid impression. However, the doughboys were also shocked by the unexpected horrors of the battlefield and astonished by the new weapons and tactics of modern warfare. Again, some of the tactics we see are some of the new weaponry, machine guns. They were so well defined, they changed the nature of the war, thus creating really a stalemate, as we referred to earlier in the notes. We see tanks, first introduced by the British in the Battle of Somme. And then we also see mustard gas as well as observation balloons. Some of the effects that we see during this time. Oftentimes life was spent in the trenches. Again, with the trenches, dirty conditions would occur. And oftentimes soldiers were left with very limited shoes as well as socks and clothes, which led to dysentery conditions. rampant with lice, rats, polluted water, which incurred other problems. Again, the trench foot, which you can see in the picture right here, it's a physical problem, uh, which is a disease caused by standing in cold, wet trenches for long periods of time without changing in dry socks or boots. First, the toes would turn red or blue, then they would become numb, and finally they would start to rot. We also see shell shock, a term coined during World War I to describe a complete emotional collapse from all the fighting or the sounds of these new weapons. Life in the trench, as you can see, was quite miserable. Some of the major World War I battles. When we talk about the World War I battles, really for the test, you're not going to really need to know any of these, but it's just important to understand how these battles play out. The first battle is the Battle of Marne, which happens in 1914. Allies stopped German advances on Paris. The second battle is going to be Ypres. Really, it's going to be three battles that are going to make up the Battle of Ypres. Germans will use the chemical weapons for the first time, the mustard gas, which I referred to on the last slide. The Battle of Somme, which is pictured above, was in 1916. That was a disastrous British offensive. And then we see the Battle of Aragon Forest. Aragon Forest really is going to mark the last American advancement to help end the war. Again, that's going to be led in 1918, and it's going to be an Allied advancement that eventually leads to the armistice signed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. U.S. during this time, American war heroes. Alvin York became famous. He was a redhead mountaineer and blacksmith in Tennessee. He sought to exempt as a conscientious objector. So again, he tried to reject the Selective Service Act, and he stated that the Bible indicates that thou shalt not kill. So he should be able to opt out and be a conscientious objector, which caught the attention of many Americans during this time. Again, when the government's mandating joining the war, and now the balance of civil liberties, specifically in this case with religious beliefs. We see the collapse of Germany. Germany agrees to a ceasefire and armistice, and the Kaiser Wilhelm II will ask Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, to write up that armistice. All in all, about 22 million people died. 48,000 were U.S. citizens, and lives at homes will change drastically. So the war at home. Congress will give power to Wilson. During this time, Wilson will stimulate the economy by really focusing efforts on producing consumer goods to producing war supplies. And again, President Wilson will have direct control. He'll also incur a War Industrials Board. The War Industrial Board will basically a regulatory body. The board encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency. It also urged them to eliminate waste by standardized production. For instance, they had production quotas. They had to allocate quotas on their raw materials used. They also, during this time, almost doubled what they had produced during the war. Corporate profits soared. We also see industries such as chemical industries, meat packing industries, oil industries, and steel industries increase in corporate profits. The WIB, again the War Industrial Board, encouraged the reduced usage of gas. They would call for gasless Sundays, lightless nights to conserve fuel. We'll see daylight savings that's incurred in 1918, which is a way to take advantage of longer days of the summer. Again, agrarian society. People will also create victory gardens. Homeowners would plant their own gardens in their yards. And oftentimes school children spent their afternoon hours growing tomatoes and cucumbers in public parks. So again, increasing food production, domestic food production. The war economy, wages in most industries rose. However, household incomes stayed stagnant because of the rising food prices and the housing costs. Stockholders during this time also received a tremendous profit. And union membership grew as well. We see union membership was about 2.5 million in 1916, and by about 1919 it had grown to nearly 4 million workers. And then when, again, the soldiers arrived back home, we'll see about 6,000 strikes broke out during and shortly after the war. Selling the war during this time, again, we'll see tax incurred, really three progressive income tax as well as a war profits tax and excise tax. Excise tax is tax on tobacco, liquor, and luxury goods. About 35.5 billion was generated, which is about a third of the amount needed to fund the war was allocated through taxation. Public information was highly publicized through propaganda techniques. There was the first propaganda agency, the Committee of Public Information, the CPI. Again, promoting why we fight, the meaning of American, as you can see with these three examples of propaganda here. We'll see the attacks on civil liberties, specifically the immigrants or also socialists. Germany and Austria-Hungary, during this time there were about 2 million Americans that shared that ancestry. Most of them would lose their jobs. They refused to play music of German ancestry. Schools stopped teaching the German language. We also see German measles was changed to Liberty measles. The hamburger, named after the German city Hamburg, became the Salisbury steak. We see sauerkraut changed to Liberty cabbage. Again, many changes at home. We also see restriction on liberties. The restriction in this case, we see the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Act. A person could be fined up to $10,000 and sentenced to 20 years in jail for interfering with the war effort or saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive against the government. Remember back to first trial when we talked about the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. And later Congress ruled that that was in violation of the First Amendment. So again, we're looking at the Espionage and Sedition Act unconstitutional, but nonetheless passed during war times, which we'll see repeated in history. But mainly the Espionage and Sedition Acts targeted socialists and labor leaders. War encouraged social change. We see African Americans, the Great Migration. In other words, the Southern blacks, as you can see with the arrows right here, migrating to the north. Again, industrial production will draw an opportunity for African Americans to seek freedoms away from the discriminatory South, as well as better paying jobs in the north. Then they also wanted to escape the Jim Crow laws, and also during that time, the black codes that were still in place. We also see W. Du Bois. Du Bois encourages blacks to support the war effort, encourages African Americans, again, to do all the government asks of them to do. We see women during this time taking on new responsibilities. Again, the women's suffrage is passed with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Women also take on different roles, such as railroad workers, cooks, dock workers, bricklayers. Again, we see women really moving beyond what is labeled as the traditional role. And again, this will create problems when the soldiers return home. We also see the flu epidemic. The flu epidemic, which occurs in 1918. The United States suffered on the home front. Really, we call it about 1/4 of the U.S. population was affected by the pandemic. We call it a pandemic in the United States, but really an epidemic because it was worldwide. But it had huge effects on our economy. Mines shut down, telephone services were cut in half, factories and offices staggered working hours to avoid contagious conditions. Cities ran short on coffins. Corpses of people laid unburied for as long as a week. This mysterious illness seemed to strike people who were otherwise in the best of health. And death could come in a matter of ways. Doctors did not know what to do other than to recommend cleanliness and quarantine. Oftentimes, people during this time wore masks, especially out in public. And we also see on a worldwide scale 30 million people had perished due to this illness. Many historians agree on this number, that this virus took 30 million lives. And again, the economic devastating effects it had on the world. Um, After all, when we look at these conditions, many people around the world thought that this is the war to end all wars. Woodrow Wilson will fight for peace. Again, quickly look through these questions, make sure you can answer them. All right, Wilson will propose 14 points. Really, the 14 points, the points are divided into three groups. The first 5 points were issues that Wilson believed had to be addressed to prevent another war. And then the third group, the next 8 points, dealt with boundary changes. Specifically, his idea was for self-determination, again, providing countries the needed support to gain independence. And then the last point was, or the 14th point, was the development of the League of Nations. And again, the last point was the most important point. The League of Nations would provide a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances without having to resort to war. Again, we look at a peacekeeping effort. However, allies reject the plan because it wasn't harsh enough, and the Big Four demanded that the French must pay. The Big Four were Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau, as well as Lloyd George and Orlando. Again, leaders of the four nations of the Allied powers. However, also the 14 points did not include the other Central Powers that were involved with World War I, and they were uncertain what to do with Russia, because Russia now had moved from Imperial Russia, will look to the emergence of a communist country or communist power. The Treaty of Versailles it established 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and shifted the borders of other nations. It carved 5 areas out of the Ottoman Empire and gave them to France and Great Britain as the mandates indicated, or also coined as temporary colonies. These two allies were to administer their respective mandates until the areas were ready for self-rule or sovereignty. The treaty barred Germany from maintaining any army. It also required Germany to return the region of Alsace-Lorraine in France and to pay reparations, again, war damages, in excess of $33 billion to the Allies. Again, the treaty had many weaknesses. The first obvious one was it completely humiliated Germany and created what historians call war guilt clause, forcing Germany to admit sole responsibility for the war. And there's no way Germany could pay the huge financial reparations that were mandated under the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was also stripped of its colonial possessions in the Pacific, which might have helped pay the reparations if they're allowed to keep those colonies. Russia, going back to Russia, they were excluded from the peace conference. It lost more territory than Germany did during this time. And it also had a problem because they ignored claims of colonized people and their movement to self-determination in the case of Southeast Asia, which was controlled under the French occupation. For the Vietnamese people controlled under the occupation of Indochina. Again, it was too harsh. That allocating the land back to France and Britain was another form of imperialism. The ethnic boundaries was not a just way to define new national boundaries. There was the debate over League of Nations at home. Many Americans felt as though this really centered on the belief that the League threatened the U.S. foreign policy of isolationism. But Wilson refuses to compromise, so he goes on a journey across the United States to promote his League of Nations. And during this promotion across the United States, which encompassed about an 8,000-mile tour. He suffered poor health throughout this entire journey, later suffers a stroke. Um, and with the weakening of Wilson, Congress will refuse to ratify the treaty, and they will just state that the U.S. will be unofficial observers at League meetings, which is kind of important to remember. An unofficial observer at League meetings. All right, so you can see the United States is in gray right here, which indicates they did not join the League of Nations. All right, the global impact of World War I. Well, one of the things that's going to usher in domestically in the United States, it's going to bring the next president, Warren G. Harding, the famous call for normalcy. Americans want to go back to what life was like before World War I. But industries, as we already referred to, in the United States were growing. Agriculture in the United States, prices were skyrocketing. But the case in Europe, specifically the central torn regions, industries in agriculture were in complete ruins. And that's going to really provide the gateway for Adolf Hitler, who's going to be a veteran of World War I, to demand Germany return to the great status prior to World War I. The hyperinflation conditions will again be a perfect opportunity for Adolf Hitler to take front and center stage. British during this time, they will call the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration is going to be an alliance between Britain and the Arab nations for dividing up what is now the Middle East. And really what it was is Britain called for the Arab nations to help support them in World War I, and if they helped them, in response they would give them their own independent nation, Palestine, which they never did. All right, some things to think about. And again, after looking at these questions, go back to the learning objectives for the week, and then start week 8's activity.